Thank you for joining us at this session on citizen science and natural hazard risk. We're going to be talking about crowdsourcing in large part, and to some extent putting people in the models. Now, I've asked our speakers to try to talk to me, an ivory tower scholar, about citizen science. I'm a total newcomer to the question of citizen science. I've only just begun to reach out and involve the public in my research. Had my first human subjects project this year. So what I want you to, what I've asked the speakers to tell me and to tell us is basically to explain to total newcomers what citizen science is. What are the capabilities of citizen scientists? What are the limitations, the boundaries of what constitutes citizen science? They're all expert at talking about what motivates citizen scientists, how to organize citizen science. But I'm also interested in your take on compliance. As a scholar working at a university, I have to complete applications to an institutional review board and make sure that I'm working with the public in a way that complies with regulations. So basically, these are the big picture topics of our presentations today and our discussion after the presentation. So I'm, as I say, a total newcomer to citizen science. And I don't even know what the real true boundaries of the topic is. Are people, presumably people collecting information about the natural world, the built environment, and the human environment constitutes citizen science. So I've got this problem of modeling how many people are involved, how might be trapped in an elevator in a big earthquake. So I'm swell at modeling the shaking, and I can create a computer model of of the power failure. But I don't know how many people are in elevators at any particular time. And as a matter of fact, I couldn't find any evidence to find that says the elevator industry knows how many people are in an elevator at 4:18 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. So that seems like an area where I could employ citizen scientists somehow to collect that information. Now, it also seems to me that people performing experiments might constitute citizen science. I've got this question that I've got to answer for the U.S. Geological Survey about earthquake early warning. Earthquake early warning is the system where an earthquake is detected, a message is sent out in seconds after the earthquake occurs, and seconds before the strong shaking arrives at people's homes and businesses and whatnot. So the idea is that we could use that message to help people drop cover and hold on, protect themselves before the strong shaking arrives. So in the time between the message arriving and them actually getting under the table and dropping, covering, and holding on, like this woman is here, they've got to decide that they need to act, and they need actually then to get under the table and do it. So they might be standing far away from the table, they might be standing out in the open, etc. And I figured I can separate those two times into the time to act, the time to decide to act, know what to do, and then the time actually, once they've decided to act, to get under the table. Now, I could use citizen science, I hope, to determine through experiment how long it takes them to get under the table. Presumably that constitutes citizen science. What about people answering surveys? Now, one big question that structural engineers face, and it was touched on during the keynotes this morning, is the fact that structural engineers just decide this is the level of safety that we are going to put into our buildings. And we never bothered to ask the public, what do you want? What do you expect? What are you willing to trade off between safety and cost? So this is probably outside the domain of citizen science, where I actually did a survey, a public opinion survey of several hundred people, and asked them, for instance, what performance objectives. I asked them first, what do you think the code calls for now? What do you think, in a big earthquake, what do you think a building is supposed to accomplish according to model building codes like the International Building Code. And then I asked them, regardless of what you think the code says, what should it say? Now they're giving their own personal opinion about this, but I'm gathering information from several hundred of them. Is that citizen science? Is it outside our domain? Nonetheless, I went ahead and I did this survey, and I found that the public doesn't really understand what the code is supposed to accomplish, but I also found that they wanted more. The respondents wanted more than the code was actually intending to provide, and I also found that they believe that people would be willing to pay more to accomplish that more resilient design objective. So this big survey went out and collected several hundred responses, and now I think we could use that information to improve our building codes and to convince public officials that they ought to adopt the building code with modifications to make the buildings in their community stronger. But, okay, so stepping back from those particular problems that I recently faced, I want you to, in your talks, again, speak to me, what do I need to know about citizen science? So our first speaker on that topic, we're just going in alphabetical order. Our first speaker is going to be Luke Barrington. I'm going to bring up your talk now. All right.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, my name's Luke, and I work at the Digital Globe, where we have satellites that take pictures of the Earth. And our satellites are orbiting the Earth right now. We've got a constellation of 4 satellites taking some of the most highest resolution images of the surface of the Earth that you can get, at least from space. And as these satellites orbit, they're beaming this huge amount of data back down to Earth to a network of remote ground terminals all over the planet, and then from there back to our headquarters here in Colorado. So just down the road is where all of these pixels are sitting and being beamed to right now. And the question that we think about every day is what to do with all of that data, right? So we collect every day we collect about as many pixels as Instagram does, right? They have 40 million little cameras, we have 4 really, really big ones, but same kind of amount of information. And so as you go through the weeks and the months, and then about every half a year when you skim the globe again, and actually point out every single pixel in these images is about half a meter on the ground, so almost a little bit bigger than this podium. So just a huge amount of data, and we found that about 95% of it never gets looked at by human eyes, right? And so how to get through all of this? And so my job at Digital Globe is all about unlocking this data out of our basement in Longmont and getting it to places where people and machines can crunch on it and look at it and analyze it and make sense of it. And so for us, what citizen science means to me is really just getting help in solving this massive image analysis problem. And so I'm going to talk to you about sort of 3 ways that we've used citizen science and crowdsourcing in general to make sense of all this information, and kind of through the lens of resiliency and all this kind of risk stuff that we're here this weekend to talk about, and to look at kind of the before, the during, and the after of a crisis event to see how this imagery added to citizen science and crowdsourcing can actually make a difference in those kinds of events. And so the first one is the one that we've been all kind of far drilling on this weekend. So I'm going to not talk too much about HOT and OSM because we've got an expert here to tell us all about it. But when we heard of Hurricane Patricia coming to make landfall this weekend, one of the first things that the kind of crowd and citizen science community will do is to try and build pre-event maps, right? To just understand the lay of the land, know where the roads, the way to get in and out are, and know what it looked like before the storm or the earthquake or the fire or whatever it was hit. And when you went into OSM a couple of days ago, this is the image that you would have seen in a satellite image that you can use to trace the OpenStreetMap network to provide that pre-event coverage. Well, I'm not sorry that the image is not great because it sucks. So what we were able to do is using some of our newer Maps APIs is to take that image out and swap this image in. And this is one of our kind of premium-based map products. And we take all of those images and mush them all together and make this most kind of seamless, beautiful, cloud-free mosaic of the planet. But because we have these nice APIs, we can get it out to millions and millions of people and then enable it for OSM tracing. I'm not going to say anything more about that. But the point is getting it out there. That's the first problem. Getting the data out of jail, as our founder and CTO likes to say. So here's another problem, similar kind of idea, but now rather than trying to understand the roads, trying to understand where the people are, right? So here's Nigeria, And as we zoom into Kano State, this is kind of one of the most populous states in Nigeria, which is the most populous country in Africa. But almost 10 million people, not very many maps. I mean, this is the zoomed out version of OSM. But as you zoom in, when you go to the cities, you see a lot. But when you go to the hinterlands, it's not a whole lot to see. However, if you look in our digital globe library, there's tons and tons of images over this region, and many within the last 6 months, completely covering Kano City. But again, that problem of how to extract the information. So our first step in this case is to use an algorithm. We have a machine learning algorithm that tries to go through and figure out where every single human settlement might be, all the things that look man-made, edges and corners and lines and spectral signatures of man-made materials. But as anyone who's spent any time on working with computers knows, computers are stupid and they make mistakes all the time. And so they need help. So what we do is we take these candidate locations from the algorithm and we present them to people online, ask for their help in validating that data, right? So we use our TomNod. Has anyone here heard of TomNod before? Have you ever used it before? Okay, so TomNod is an online website, a platform where we can present imagery analysis tasks to the public. And over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, we've built up a pretty big crowd, almost 1 million email addresses and many more unregistered users who can come and help us solve simple imagery analysis tasks like this. So this, for me, my definition of citizen science right now is distributing huge image analysis tasks out to the public and combining their inputs to make sense of it all. So this is very simple. Is this white polygon around a man-made settlement? It's pretty easy to just press 1 for yes, 2 for no, right? So that'd be yes, and in our data set it would turn green on the map and we validated that location. What about this one? Algorithm made a mistake here. It detected some linear features with high reflectance, but not actually settlements, so that would be a no. Again, easy for a person to spot that, turns red. How about another one? Yep, settlements in there, turn it green. Settlements in there, yep, turn it green. Do that about another 680,000 times. And what you're left with is data that looks like this, where you've now validated every single algorithm output and produced a high quality, reliable data set of where the population centers actually are. And so now you can do all sorts of fun stuff like go in and attribute each of those locations and figure out how many people are actually living there based on building density, or extract building footprints. Or in our case, actually, we've been using this data to help some NGOs eradicate polio from the continent of Africa. So we've done this in Swaziland to help people distribute malaria vaccines, and in Nigeria, and I mentioned before in Somalia, to actually figure out where to vaccinate against polio and remove that disease from the continent. And more recently, we did this in Nepal, where, again, before an event, you can go in and try and figure out where people live. And why were we doing this in Nepal? I don't probably have to set this up too much, but because not too long ago, we needed to know where people live to see if they were okay. So when Nepal hit, before the quake, this is how a digital globe image showed downtown Kathmandu. And after the quake, just a few hours later, we were getting images that looked like this. Here's another example from, again, downtown Kathmandu, where you can see destruction as well as huge amounts of IDP camps spraying up. So figuring that out, that Kathmandu got screwed by the earthquake, well, you didn't need citizen science or basically anyone to tell you that. You just read it in the news. But what about the rest of the country? That was the question that we were asking. And so again, another opportunity where satellite imagery can get through a huge amount of area that people on the ground can't get to. So we launched again this campaign to our TomNod crowd, and we had tens of thousands of people come and provide tons of data on a map like this. About 60,000 people placed almost 1 million tags. And then we used some algorithms and statistical inference to figure out, and this keeps on jumping forward without me wanting it to, where all the locations of destruction are. So this is the kind of data that we're able to pull out using the wisdom of the crowd and the consensus of multiple, in this case tens of thousands of people, all locating different features as they combine and provide consensus for each other. We can actually zoom in to the most important and most reliable locations. And so now you're able to find places outside of Kathmandu where there are damaged roads that first responders wouldn't be able to get in and help out, where there are damaged buildings, telling them where they need to go in the first place. And as the crisis went down, we saw more and more IDP camps and temporary buildings springing up. Okay, so that's the kind of the during, right? We're able to provide a baseline of where people are using those kind of population location algorithms, and then during an event, very quickly get imagery online. We're doing this with Patricia right now. We just had our first 5 or 6 images go online this morning, and they're in a TomNod campaign on our site right now if you want to go and have a look. Although thankfully the damage wasn't too bad in this instance. But we're able to get it online very quickly and have that pre-event baseline and then the during event response. But what about after? So I'm going to go to a completely different part of the world. This is a zoomed-in 2-centimeter aerial photograph, so not a digital satellite image, but the same kind of idea. A very nice picture of the Earth taken from above, of Kauai, the middle of Hawaii in Hawaii, where invasive plant species have been taking over a lot of the native vegetation and kind of muscling out the local plants. And so we worked with the Nature Conservancy to try and figure out how to respond to the aftermath of this invasion. The trees are taken over. Where are they? How many of them are there? How do we stop them? And again, we asked the Tamai crowd to look through these images and pinpoint all these specific Australian tree ferns, which the Nature Conservancy has asked us to find. And again, in this high-resolution imagery, they're very distinctive, but there's tons of them and there's tons of imagery, and it takes ages to find them all by yourself. So we had about 44 square kilometers, so much smaller AOI, but very much higher resolution in this case, and more than 10,000 tree taggers who were able to go through and drop 2 million points onto that map, and then find almost 1 million of these different locations of invasive species. And so what you get out of this, you take a huge, massive, heavy, high-resolution data set, and what you get out is a very lightweight file that looks like this, with 22,000 points of where the invasive species are. And so now the Nature Conservancy was able to use this for their analysis to figure out how to prevent the spread. And actually, this is my favorite part, fly helicopters and take these very targeted herbicides with like a milliliter of herbicide and drop it right in the core of the tree that we identified, and just kill that tree and leave all of the remaining species around untouched. So, quick snapshot, I see about 15 seconds left, and that's good because I'm done. And of the before, the during, and the after. And again, so for me, citizen science is about distributing massive imagery analysis tasks out to huge amounts of people, motivating them to contribute, and I can talk way more about that maybe in the questions, how to motivate them, and then making sense of all of their contributions and figuring out actually what's happening on the surface of the Earth.
Awesome.
Thank you.
The end of the fourth presentation, and then, ask them then. So our next speaker, Russ Defner, is with the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. He coordinated 8,000 volunteers to create maps of the Nepal earthquake. He's going to talk about volunteer activation protocols, about interfacing with community organizations and others.
Yeah, so everybody, I'm Russell Defner. First and foremost, I'm a volunteer with the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, or HOT. We're found at ottawasm.org if you want to explore our website. And we're most known for our coordinating of, editing and data collection in response to disaster. Kind of the first organized HOT activation that's sort of our origin of the organization was back in Haiti in 2010 when there was an earthquake there. And basically, as the aid organizations were organizing their response, they were struggling to find good base maps for making that coordination happen. We were able to rally our community of online remote mappers to quickly trace the satellite imagery, mainly from digital globes, thank you, so that we can create those base maps so that they have something to start with. Just a little bit about the founding organization. Quote from our founding member, of course, this map being OpenStreetMap that we're talking about, which is commonly referred to as the Wikipedia of maps. In the early days of OpenStreetMap, that ranged from 2005 to about 2010, there were efforts to do this kind of disaster mapping, but there was a lot of, even with only a few dozen mappers trying to map the same location, there was a lot of conflicts, there was a lot of duplication of efforts, so HOT was basically formed to do that organization part. We mainly do this through a piece of software that we developed and maintain called the Tasking Manager, the OpenStreetMap Tasking Manager. The tool has been an incredible success. As in the case with Nepal, you hear numbers from 7 to 9,000 contributors, just depending on what kind of time frame they're looking at and how sort of strict their analysis was on what they consider contributing. We like to say 7 to 8,000, but a number approaching 10,000 individual contributors went through our tasking manager to contribute to mapping in Nepal after the earthquake. The tool itself is open source, so much like OpenStreetMap itself, it's openly developed. You can actually find other instances of the tasking manager now exist out there for training and other purposes. Our main instance is found at task.hotosm.org, and that's where you can find the current mapping tasks, including the response to Hurricane Patricia. This is a screen capture I took just several hours after we announced to our community that we were activating for the hurricane. And yeah, so you can see, I want to say this was almost exactly 2 hours after the email went out. If you can't read the text, some of the story behind this is 36 people were already actively contributing to the mapping. The entire project, which was the coastline of Mexico there, roughly half of it was already complete, and also people had already started coming through. Some of our expert mappers were already coming through on the second wave to validate that data. This is just another capture from one of these really neat tools that you can find at resultsmap.nice.one.org. It does say at the top that it's the last 30 days, but it's actually really only capturing the first roughly 24 hours of our response to Patricia. The story behind the numbers here are, again, within the first 24 hours, we had 176 OpenStreetMap contributors jump on. They had made almost 350,000 changes to the map, and that included number of highways, so almost 5,000 new road segments were added to the map, as well as over 17,000 buildings. And again, all this within the first 24 hours of the response. And one thing that's really the power of OpenStreetMap and using a platform like OpenStreetMap is not only can we rally a large number of people to start editing, but immediately our friends and partners can start taking that data and making maps for their own purposes and using the data. This happens to be just an example from Copernicus. I know you probably can't see much of this on the left. That's the entire map, a little zoomed in. All the red and sort of the stuff that pops out is the vector data coming straight from OpenStreetMap. And this was the Copernicus Emergency Management Service Rapid Mapping Reference Maps. And they actually created these almost immediately as the hurricane was making landfall. They were pumping these maps out for their partners and other aid and response organizations to go ahead and have a base map to work off of. Besides sort of building a map, the data and the underlying base map of OpenStreetMap can also be sort of inserted or mashed up with other platforms. This picture happens to be the KLL, Kathmandu Living Labs team. The Kathmandu Living Labs team operating in their parking lot one day after the earthquake because their building was actually damaged during the earthquake. Not only at this point, basically 24 hours later or the next day, they were coordinating with us, with the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team to provide sort of where do we need the mapping efforts to be focused, but they were also building an instance of Ushahidi called quickmap.org, and they would go on to operate this quickmaps.org site to collect and disseminate areas of need. So they were getting citizen scientists or citizens in general going on here, reporting a need or a problem, and then actually the Nepal army was collaborating with them, taking those and sort of coordinating their response. But it really goes back to the local mappers. You know, we're kind of famous for our coordinating of remote mappers, but the idea behind OpenStreetMap and another program of ours is to build up the local mappers. So we actually have a community building program at HOT where we send our experts into the field to train people on OpenStreetMap and organize some mapping projects. These are actually images from my time in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, training a local community there. Really, let me stop there for a second. Because really, there's only so much we can do remotely mapping. Ideally, with OpenStreetMap, you have local teams in there that can kind of add the flavor to the map. They can add business names, construction materials, the stuff that you really can't capture from a satellite imagery. And just to wrap up, I'll tell you a little bit more about internally. We also not only developed the tasking manager, but we've developed some other tools. We have an export tool for quickly getting at the OpenStreetMap data. Our new big project is Open Aerial Map, which is kind of a similar idea to OpenStreetMap, but in this case, we're looking to collect and disseminate openly licensed satellite and aerial imagery. And then we have a suite of training platforms, learnosm.org for basic OpenStreetMap training. We actually have a team that's been in Jakarta since 2011, which helps train and develop training materials for NSAFE, which is a tool, a GIS plugin, or a QGIS plugin for disaster risk analysis. And of course, we have a bunch of great partners. I won't try to name them all, but I'll just quickly talk about these sort of longer term partner projects. MapGive is kind of our flagship partnership program, which is with the US State Department. They still have some of the best videos for getting started with OpenStreetMap and how to contribute to our disaster program. Missingmaps.org is focused on mapping the places where the world's most vulnerable populations live. Fieldpapers.org, we just within the last year invested some resources to develop that tool further. It's a field survey tool. And OpenMapKit, which is under development right now with our partners at the Red Cross, which we hope to have become sort of the go-to app for mobile device data collection. Of course, it takes a whole bunch of people. This is a shot from our inaugural summit of the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, which was in DC in May. And of course, we're mainly project-based organization, but we're really trying to turn the corner. And if you like what we're doing and want to help us out, check out autosim.org/donate. Thank you.
Matt Kelch is a hydrometeorologist at University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. He's going to talk about the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network, whose volunteers report precipitation, for example, to detect the onset and impacts of drought. Let me get yours, Mark.
All right, as I said, my name is Matt Kelch. I work with the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. I'm a meteorologist by background, but what's relevant about what I do for this talk is I am one of the cooperative climate observers in the United States. There are several thousand of them. We're volunteers for the National Weather Service. And I'm an observer and a coordinator for the COCORAS, which stands for the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Observing Network. The photo you see here is from the evening of July 28, 1997, after 10 inches of rain hit Fort Collins in 5 hours. And as the surge of water came through, everything started floating, including propane tanks and electric lines were breaking, so you had explosions and fires of things that were floating. So in the aftermath, the next day, the state climatologist, who's located up at CSU suffered about $200 million worth of damage. He went around and found there were a lot of citizens that really wanted to do something about this. They wanted to be able to contribute. And one of the things we all realized is we need to really have a good detailed analysis when we have these major precipitation events of exactly what happened, so we could model and plan for them better in our growing cities, especially in the West, but all across the country. So I was asked, what do citizens observers provide? Well, they provide information that's good for scientific research, for planning, road utility, snow removal, all that kind of stuff. Then there's things that maybe you hadn't thought about. A number of the observations are even used by law enforcement. For instance, if there's a crime and footprints were left in the snow, they need to know about what time that snow happened. So meteorology is used forensically too. What do citizen observers get? Well, they get a more flexible and resilient community because we know what happens and we know what's planned for, then cities can be more resilient in how they have building codes and urban planning. Positive role in the local and larger community, and this is a big one, especially for the younger observers, the thrill of having your observations mentioned on TV or in the website of the National Weather Service, because people are sometimes singled out, 7.5 inches of snow fell in 3 hours in Longmont, and someone will, oh, that was my report, and they get all excited. How do they get engaged? Well, we have to demonstrate the benefits, but the bigger thing, and this is where Fort Collins comes in, is take advantage of major events. When something big happens, people are wanting to do something. That's just a natural thing we see all over the country. So after Kokoraz got started following the Fort Collins flood in 1998 in Larimer and Boulder County, by 1999, I was bringing it down into Boulder County and training people. In the early 2000s, it was spreading to the Denver metro area. If you remember, the early 2000s was a pretty dry period around here. 2002, we're in water restrictions. Drought, of course, is very important, but people don't get all excited about going and measuring an empty gauge every day. So we had to think about how do you keep people engaged? And then comes March of 2003, one of the bigger snowstorms in Front Range history. For Boulder, the depth of the snow is actually the 5th biggest in the last 30 years, so it was big but not phenomenal. But it was the amount of liquid in it and the amount of snow that fell on the foothill, where we had 60 or 70 inches. And I should explain, the way these rain gauges work, there's an outer cylinder that concentrates an inch of rain in the inner cylinder, so you can measure it very precisely. And if there's more than an inch of rain, it overflows into the outer cylinder, so you can collect up to 10 inches. When it snows, we collect the snow in here and melt it down to get the liquid equivalent. When you have 60 inches of snow, you can imagine this thing's getting overflowed quite a bit. And we had observers in Coal Creek in Netherlands who would go out every couple hours, they'd measure the liquid of the snow in there, and then of course the snow's getting this deep, they're putting it up higher and higher. And so we had some really dedicated observers and a lot of interest afterwards in people becoming Kokoraz observers. So through the 2005-2006 period, Kokoraz went throughout the state, and today Kokoraz is in all 50 states, Canadian provinces, and several Mexican states. And it's often the big events, like big events we saw, floods in Georgia in 2009, Hurricane Irene in 2011, just a number of them that really get people interested and they become citizen observers. So in March of 2003, this was taken in Jefferson County here. At the time, we weren't quite statewide. Here's Boulder County here, Denver's down here, Colorado, Wyoming border here. You could just see each of these little asterisks was an observer at the time, and more today. And these orange and red ones are where there was over 3 inches of liquid equivalent in one day. This was a 3-day event. So there was a lot of water came down that ended the Front Range drought very quickly. They also measure snow depth. And this was the analysis using Kokoraz. Again, Boulder County is right here. Boulder's right there. Here's Denver right here. These are 60 to 80 inches of snow from Netherland down into parts of western Douglas County and Gilpin County. So just a huge amount of snow. And measuring the snow and the liquid equivalent is really important for building code. What do our buildings have to sustain? What kind of weight on the roof and stuff like that? So it's very important to get this kind of detail. Because as you can see in a big snowstorm, there's often a lot of spatial variability. If you notice here, there's a little bit of hole in the precipitation. Lyons got 2 inches of snow in that storm. People came out, they still saw grass poking out from the snow, while Denver had 30 inches of snow and so did Fort Collins. So the variability was interesting, and I remember we called that the Lyons hole at the time, and Longmont only got about 10 or 12 in that storm. So, the variability is very interesting. It helps the state know where they have to send their resources, because utility lines got broken and stuff like that because of the heavy nature of the snow. Let's flash forward to September of 2013. At this point, Kokoraz is nationwide. Colorado observers are there, and they're doing their thing each year. This was taken on September 12th. This is the bridge at Broadway, Boulder Creek. This was still about 1 to 2 feet below its peak. It crested that particular night. And this, for those of you who are here, you remember it was a big rain event and lots of flooding all over the place, and we're still recovering from it in some of the little communities. This was the statewide Coparaz rainfall for September 12th only, and that occurred over several days. So here's the state of Colorado, again, Boulder there in Larimer County. These red and oranges are, and this is just one day now, these are getting into the 6 to 8 inch range in one day, and this occurred over several days. And, still use that again, but break.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's
Better
good, you got it there.
Take it over anyway.
It's plastic, it won't break. So that was statewide. Now you notice that the rain was really concentrated in the front range from Colorado Springs northward, western part of the state that can get as much. If we zoom in on Boulder County, and this is just for September 12th, we're getting those really big amounts, 6 to 8 inches in Boulder, but you notice there's not a lot of reports here. Now some of that is we just don't have as many observers, but another big piece of that was people were dealing with more serious things than reading their rain gauge. Being evacuated. We did have my one observer in Lyons. At that time, the city was already without potable water and electricity, but she was texting me on the cell phone so I could enter precipitation. So we had some really dedicated observers is what I'm getting at here. I mentioned there's also the co-op observers. Coparaz is more than 10,000 people nationwide. And then the National Weather Service has volunteer observers. Rain gauges are a little bigger. And this is me. I am the co-op observer for Boulder, measuring the record 9.08 inches of rain in Boulder. This is on the NOAA campus in South Boulder, back on September 12th. Coparaz, these are all the reports that came in. Okay, so here's Larimer County, Boulder County, Jefferson County, Denver. And there was an area of, and this is over 3 days, of 15 to 18 inches of rain stretching from Boulder up toward Estes Park. This, again, we didn't have a lot of reports here, but some what we call bucket survey, where we go around and talk to people. If there was any receptacle that was empty before the storm, we could use it to estimate the rain. And chances are there was 16 to 18 inches of rain, even up through parts of the Big Thompson Canyon. We've been up there after the storm, you know, there was quite a bit of damage there. So this is the kind of detail that's really important for planners, so we know what could happen here. Climate's not stationary, what might happen in the future. This is Bear Creek, just west of US Highway 36. This is the bike path. Boulder is resilient in that a lot of our bike paths, almost all of our bike paths, are also greenways and floodways to open up the 100-year floodplain and let the water through in a big event like this. So this is what that particular vantage point looks like when Bear Creek is in its normal flow over here. And this was during the surge of water that came down on September 12th. Here I'm going to have what it looked like. Again, this was the big rain occurred the night of September 11th, morning 12th. This is later in the day on the 12th. There we go. So before I go to the last slide, I also want to mention during the storm, because we were getting 9-10 inches of rain, and this can hold 10 inches, we didn't get very many instances where the gauges overflowed. But what was happening, several people, they'd been observing for years, and this was the exciting event. You know, it was filled up to here, and said, oh wow, I have such a great big amount of rain I'm going to report today. They picked it up, not realizing how heavy it is, because we usually don't get that much rain, and it's wet, and several people picked it up and dropped it, and the water went all over the ground. So the reports of the big storm were not done because of that. And that happened several times. So in our training now, we remind people when there's a lot of rain, the rain gauges are heavy, they're slippery, be careful, it's all that kind of stuff that we have to do as we train people. I want to mention drought and fire. It's not as exciting, but it's certainly big impact. And when we were having all those fires in 2012, there were several times that people did have to, we reminded them the zeros are important. So just to wrap up, looks like my time's up. Citizen science observers build a better, more disaster-resistant community and get a greater sense of community. And weather's fascinating, devastating, but we're all with it and we all have weather in common, and that's what this tries to build on.
Thanks. All right. Thanks. Our last speaker is Louise St. Dennis of Senior Project EPIC.
So here we go. Thanks for having me here. So my research is not in citizen science, but I work with a community that's really interested in gathering information directly from the community during a disaster. And so I figured I would focus on some of the strategies they've used to try and get the most relevant information out. So I put Leisha's, I work in the crisis informatics group at CU, and I put Leisha's definition of crisis informatics up there. But it is the study of the use of social media and communication technology in disaster, particularly looking at social computing, the ways that people share information, organize, and solve problems in a socially distributed way. So within that research, my research focuses on the use of social media in emergency response. And for emergency responders, use of social media has lagged far behind public use. And that's happened for a number of reasons. First of all, the emergency responders use a very formalized process and procedures for managing emergencies. And the informal channels of social media don't really mesh well with that. There's also for a long time been distrust of the use of social media as information in disaster. There were no dedicated resources for use of social media or structures or models for how to use it. So my research I've been working with a concept called virtual operational support, and I've been working with a group of emergency responders. This idea came out of a grassroots effort from within emergency response, and it's an extension of the idea of digital volunteerism. So the idea of the VOST is that teams of emergency responders and people with emergency management experience would come together ahead of an emergency and form a team of digital volunteers. And the idea is that this team is predefined. They are trained and trusted by the other members of the team. And in the event of a disaster in one of the team members' regions, everybody else would step up as an extension to the emergency management team on the ground. And they operate in the digital world, but they've worked to define processes and protocols that align well with formal response. So the first trial of this idea was in 2011 on the Shadow Lake fire. The PIO for a federal team, Portland Nemo, was facing strict mandate against the use of social media. And so she saw the idea of the VOST as a way to get around that and do what she really wanted to do, which was to share emergency messaging through social media. So in a bit of an improvisation, she pulled together a team and they implemented the first virtual operational support team. And they essentially, the team of volunteers operated virtually in support of the team on the ground, and they coordinated all of the emergency messaging and social media monitoring during the incident. And since then, the idea, news of the successful trial got out, and the community actually pulled together pretty quickly, and a number of teams formed in the U.S. This is a current view of things. So there's currently 4 federal teams, and this is a look at the teams distributed around the United States. It's also grown worldwide, so strong presence in North America and Europe. There's a team in Australia, New Zealand, and also Panama. So to define what a VOST actually does, their primary focus is really on situational awareness and monitoring on social media. And anybody who has followed social media during disaster knows what a high volume of communication there is and how complex that information space is. So on behalf of the team on the ground, they monitor social media and other channels. They look specifically for key concerns coming from the public, questions that could indicate information gaps that they need to address in their messaging. And then, so that's what I'm going to focus on because I think that's what's most relevant for this talk. So I'm a member of 3 federal teams, 3 state level teams, and 2 county level teams. And so I've been working embedded as a researcher within these teams to understand, it's action research, but often the circumstances of disaster are what create the challenges that we then have to figure out how to address. So I've identified 3 key approaches to how they gather information from the public. And the first one is to just ask the public, which seems like a really obvious thing, but it actually rarely happens. And so I'm going to highlight one instance where it did happen. So during the Colorado floods in 2013, I was part of the Jefferson County team just south of here. And for that team, all of the media attention was focused on what was happening in Boulder. And there was almost no coverage for Jefferson County. And so they're a highly skilled team. And so they figured out early on they needed to gather information from the public so that they could secure a disaster declaration. And so what they did was they pulled together a form. They have a strong following on social media. And they sent out a request to their community. And they said, please send us your information. Give us the information about where you took it, time and place, any other information you want to volunteer, and permission for us to use this. And in a very short period of time, they had hundreds of responses, great information. They were able to use that to secure a federal disaster declaration, and also get a good picture of what was happening within their community. This is an example of some of the photos that were sent in. But they did something else that I think was really relevant, is that they also worked to create a space for conversation. So they took all of this information that came in from the public, and their Facebook page focuses around community conversation. So they uploaded all the public content. They also put their own content up there. And you realize very quickly how making that information available, people are great at volunteering additional information. So going through, here's an example, they had aerial photos, but no additional information about, they just had a picture, no information about exactly where it was taken. And members of the public stepped up and started contributing information about specific landmarks or conditions or how things were changing. So I thought that was really interesting. And so the third and most complicated is social media monitoring. And like I mentioned, it's very challenging to make sure emergency responders are really concerned about picking up on information that they might miss that has emergency relevance. So as a member of Project EPIC, working with these teams, a few years ago I started asking, is there a way that we can use these large Twitter data collections that we have on Project EPIC to help support the social media monitoring efforts within these teams? And so I've traveled across numerous incidents, but in 2014 I used it on the Carlton complex, which was a huge wildfire in northeastern Washington. It ended up being the worst fire in Washington state history at that point. And so during the fire, I was using the information to try and provide them with additional information as part of their support. And then afterwards, we met and we were talking about all the reporting that I provided during the fire. And the lead PIO that I worked with quite a bit, she said to me, you know, I think that the information you gave us was great. I'm so thankful for your help. But really, what you're doing is you're telling us more about what we already know. And what I really, really want to know, in the thick of it, is what I don't know. And so we kept the conversation going, and what she was getting at was that all this information I was telling her about known sources wasn't telling her about the pieces of information that often slip through the cracks. So I walked away from that conversation and I thought, what if I take what I did and I flip it around? What if I take what I know to figure out what I don't know? So I took the data that I had, and my logic was, if it comes from a known source that we think, oh, I'm so sorry, I'll go quick. If it comes from a known source or contains information from a known source that we don't think is likely to have relevant information, I'm going to filter it out. And the results were actually striking. We filtered out about 88% of the data. And looking at this on the highest volume day, it reduced it to 68 tweets during the peak hour, which is turbulent. It's a one-person job. We also, when we took it a step further, I repeated the study and realized that this content, of the filtered content, half of it came from individual and local sources. And the information that it contained was highly localized and contained a lot of personal narrative. We also found when we filtered down to this level of information, we could start to make connections between the data and get information that's not contained in an individual tweet or an individual post. That ended up helping us piece together a story over time. I ended up repeating it on an incident over the summer, the Wolverine fire in the Chelan complex, and we learned some valuable lessons. During the early part of the fire, the filtering didn't help us at all. There was not enough traffic for it to matter. But on the 13th, there was a dry lightning storm that caused a new set of fires to encroach upon the town where incident command was. And as the fire was coming over the hill, they tweeted a photo, or posted a photo to us and said, "Your public information while we move incident command." And so that's when, at that point, we were public information and monitoring, and about the information in the filtered data set was critical. We were able to get out like safety situations and forward them on. And then later, a few days later, the tweet volume went through the roof when the tragedy happened in Twist. And we realized that even the filtering strategy that I'd set up didn't work. It demonstrated to us that we're at a point, there's some value in combining things like machine learning to help us also supplement this.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so now, questions? Yes?
In all these cases, do you have strategies for soliciting volunteers? And are they, I'm curious if they're different for each of you.
I'll take a look and see. Strategies for soliciting volunteers is kind of what we built ourselves on, right? It's like we have great strategies for getting data, but getting the people to look at the data is the biggest problem all the time. And so we have been playing around with this for a long time, and I think it runs the full gamut from, you talked earlier about motivation, right? If you're contributing to something like Patricia, or to fire in your neighborhood, you're obviously motivated, instinctive, altruistic, or social good kind of thing. And sometimes it's curiosity. MH370 is one of our biggest ever timeline campaigns. The whole world was like freaking out about that for 1 week, right? And so this was some way that people could get a new perspective and maybe actually contribute. But in other cases, and I don't know like this, but we will often do campaigns where we pay people in kind of return, like micropayments, or reach out to specific communities who you know are engaged with the problem. And so the full thing from your Facebook, Twitter, forums, email blasts, all the way down to payments and people who are in the know or in the community. It's like, you've got to do it all over. But it's the biggest challenge, for sure. Motivating and not making sense.
And what I mentioned in the talk is we take advantage of major weather occurrences. Because I get quoted by the camera a lot, since I'm an official climate observer of Boulder, that's one avenue. You know, they will mention Cocoras and a lot of times, not all the time. But also after the floods in September of 2013, I gave a talk at the Dairy Center. It was a packed audience, and that was another time to really say, well, without the Cocoras rain gauges, we wouldn't know a lot about the detail. And other coordinators do that in other parts of the country.
So for me, the teams that I work with are really dependent upon volunteers, and they're always actively recruiting, but they have a commitment. So you have to go through training, you have to pass unit qualifications, you have to make the time commitment and participate in their ongoing social media.
We'll take anybody that wants a map. Really, the strategy for HOT on recruiting is parallel to OpenStreetMap of just, if you're passionate about your community, if you're passionate about mapping an event, we want you on there, get your skills up, and then kind of I think our struggle now is maintaining their motivation. So we're really looking at like how do we keep people engaged so that the next event they're already trained and ready to go.
Like you said, I mean, there's a big strata here, right? I mean, the amount of people who are willing to sign up and have a rain gauge sent to them and stick outside their house and empty it every day and send the results back to you is like smaller, but more dedicated and more like focused. And so that engagement is very different than getting people to tweet, right? That's like everyone's doing it anyway. Just how do you make sense of it all? So there's this big structure, and I think we're kind of in the middle where you guys are a bit more expert mappers and know about polygons and lines and how to connect them and how to make it square. I'm not just like click, 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 click. There's not much yet. We're deliberately trying to make it simple. And so that the complexity of the task speaks a lot to how you, the kind of people you need and how you go get to people.
Question?
I'm interested in increasing connections between residents. There's a lot of talk about the importance of that for disaster preparedness and response. And I'm trying to think how some of the mapping or the social media stuff could work kind of backwards to build those relationships. I'm thinking, maps are kind of interesting, and they might kind of bring people together. Oh, the people behind me have a swing set or something. I'm just initially thinking of some ways to really build those relationships. Right now, it's so fractured, it seems like in the neighborhoods. I got an idea for a network of neighborhood points of contact that requires some push to something to make people connect.
So it sounds like you're saying the volunteers that our panelists have been using, they provide data, but you also want to make connections between those volunteers through the, whether, I guess, platform, these kinds of platforms. Comments?
Yeah, I have some comments. I've seen some really, as part of my research, I've seen some really interesting things happen within communities impacted by disaster, where groups will come together on, say on Facebook and organize as a community. And one of the public information officers that I work with, she's completely shifted her focus to trying to foster community connection. So as a federal PIO, she started to come in at a community level and push official updates directly through these community channels and to reinforce the local emergency services. And it's still really early in this research, but it's amazing to see it followed from the point of incident and beyond how connected those members of the community stay after an event. Now even during an event, they start really coordinating and helping each other.
Any other responses to the question of the minute?
There is an interesting thing that happens with the maps of the different gauge reports, and I'll use one example. When Oklahoma City had a tornado go through, there was a swath of the city that no longer had internet connection. So no gauges showed up, and there were a lot of, I heard from the coordinators down there, a lot of inquiry about, are our neighbors okay? When are they going to come back? So there was definitely a sense of community there when the reports suddenly were gone.
I have a question. Matt, it seems like you're the only one who has to be concerned with statistical representativeness of all of the talks that we've talked about that you've given today. Have you had to deal with selection bias, or the problem of people providing data that are not representative of the population or of their particular location? Have you had to struggle with statistical bias in your responses?
The bias is that urban areas are going to have more reports than rural areas and mountain areas. So that's one bias. After the September floods, there were a couple reports that seemed out of step with other ones, and I actually went to a number of locations to evaluate the site, and there were a few that they had to disqualify because trees had grown over the top, or they were right next to the house where there would be splash off the roof and things like that. So we do go out sometimes and try to remind people where their gauges have to be, but there's always the bias of having more where the population is. But that's still okay. I mean, we like to have that detail in urban areas. The other network I talked about, the co-op, is much more rigorous, that you have to report every day, and there are certain standards you follow. COPARAS, it is all volunteer. Not everybody reports every day. Some people do, not everybody. We get a certain percentage that drop out in the winter. They don't really deal with the snow. So there is some biases there, but it's still the most dense precipitation observing network in the country.
So what do you tell the, you publish a paper that says you're using these volunteers to collect data, and you're, you get some snarky comment, oh, well, it's not statistically representative because X, Y, and Z, which presumably you acknowledge in the paper. Do you, is your answer, well, it is what it is, it's better than not having the data?
COPROS doesn't claim to be a long history. You know, we're not doing statistics of, well, you know, this is how the trend in precipitation has been. We don't have the consistency or the length, the duration of observations. That's what other networks that aren't quite as dense are used for. But what it is good for, as I showed in snowstorms, like, you know, Boston snows and the big rains in South Carolina, is showing the detail of single events that happen that are real important for planners.
I kind of think that.
Yeah, please.
I think statistics is at the core of all crowdsourcing citizen science, and if you're not aware of that, you're going to get lousy results. You just chuck your big data problem online and hope the internet will solve it for you, and we'll get garbage. And so even if you go back to, like, you used to talk about your surveys and polling. Polling is the earliest form of pressure ever that's been, right? Just ask a bunch of people what they think about something and then make a decision based off of that. And you know, we see this all the time, especially if you think about paying people for doing work online, which we often do. If you're paying them per click or per area of imagery viewed, there's an incentive there to skip through it or to click erroneously or to just, maybe you don't even know what you're doing because you've never seen a satellite image before, and certainly haven't seen a satellite image of an earthquake that happened to do when you live in Indiana. So being able to infer from all of them, Twitter shows in spades, right? Being able to infer from all this data what the actual decision is or what the outcome is or what the right answer is inherently a statistics problem, right? And so we think about that a lot, like how many people do you need to look at a given image or click at a given point before you're confident that's a good point, and then what does it tell you about those people so when they click on future points, you know something about what they've done in the past, and how you can kind of like build on that knowledge through this very unstructured and very messy data.
Have you published on that? I mean, what your statistical tests are?
Yeah, we've published some stuff. I mean, like, since graduating from a PhD and moving into the corporate world, my emphasis on publishing has diminished. But we have published a bunch of stuff, and we have some open source stuff as well. And there's a whole, I would say, a whole field of literature on how to sort of infer from crowdsourced data, which is kind of comes from the statistical survey stuff, but then just it's less structured the question that you're asking because you have to treat it accordingly.
You know, we have to produce proceedings for this session, and you know, sort of taking notes as we go along. But I think one of the points I'd like to include in the proceedings is you've got a few pointers to key pieces of literature.
Sure.
For those statistical tests. If any of you do, I would love to include them in the proceedings.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole industry built around Twitter analytic dashboard. I mean, billion-dollar companies who sell software so those to make sense of what your tweets are saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be right.
Right.
I don't know if they publish either, but yeah.
Can you guys maybe also expand a little bit upon, I think that in the context of risk and other things we're talking about, we're seeing the shift, and citizen science included, from kind of model data to observed data and how that's able to benefit communities in all kinds of new ways. Can you guys just kind of expand on, in your experience, how you are observing that shift and kind of its benefit, this going from modeled or theoretical data to observed data, including citizen science and crowdsourcing and all kinds of stuff?
Sure, I'll take credit. With OpenStreetMap, it's interesting because it actually really started as an observation. You know, there was no imagery to trace from. It was people going out with GPSs and making that physical observation of their neighborhood. With imagery and some of the technology that's come around, we've sort of shifted to where a lot of it's that larger picture, having millions of people tracing the map, and maybe they've never seen that area, but they're able to see a road and trace it. But we really are also trying to shift back to, once that base map's built, we need that local observation to really pick up the key details that make a really good, accurate map that's usable for risk So it is an interesting dynamic, and that's why we're really kind of, at OpenStreetMap, or at Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, we're trying to kind of push it back down to the observed rather than the broad.
And speaking from the meteorological field, modeled and observed go hand in hand. There's always the modeling going on, but you need to know if what your models are forecasting is actually being seen on the ground. And that's where citizens come in. But the other thing that happened is about the time CocoRoz was coming into play, a lot of long-time weather stations were going automated. They used to be human observers, now they're automated. That's great for temperature and wind, but for precipitation, it's been a real problem. Automated rain gauges have a lot of problems. So CocoRoz came in and filled in the void that there's still someone that puts their eyes on the instrument and actually reads not only the rain, but the snow is even more important. Automated gauges are really poor at getting the liquid equivalent of snow. They have a hard time melting it without evaporating it.
I'm curious about risk assessment. You just mentioned that, I'm thinking digital globe and OpenStreetMaps, there's some potential there. I think especially for Epic, that's probably a good avenue for getting risk, for getting input from citizens of what potential risks there are.
The person who talked about that would be Robert Simmons. It's one of his area of expertise. So yeah, we definitely have a conversation about it.
What are the limitations of citizen science? Now, the problem that I'm thinking about at the moment is collecting building exposure information in sub-Saharan Africa. Knowing how many people are in a typical apartment building, or knowing what, where all of the schools in Niger are, that sort of thing. We talked a little bit about Kathmandu, Nepal, etc. What are there? If I want to use citizen science to collect this missing information, stuff that I don't know about where the buildings and where the school's made of and so on, how am I going to be able to do that? Is that at some boundary of our capabilities?
One of the things I've seen from common to all the things we talked about has been that transition from digital to real world.
Mm-hmm.
So Talmud is great because we can reach out to literally millions of people and have them all come and look at an image from somewhere that's thousands of miles away from them, and they can do something, they can analyze it, interpret it, and provide feedback that hopefully we can make use of, and send to someone who can do something in the real world. But the citizen scientist in this sense is disconnected from the physical location of the task. But as you start to see things like with the hot team, like actually bringing it back on the ground again, and obviously with CocoRoz, like getting to people on the ground is where the true science happens. I mean, there's citizens who contribute to your science project, and then there are citizens who do science, right? And
Right.
probably we're more the former a little bit. But so how do you take, like I can show you the footprint of a building in Niger. It's hard for me to tell you the school, and I definitely can't tell you how many kids go there, right, from a satellite image. So you need someone on the ground there, and how to reach out and engage to those communities that's where I think the kind of that border or the frontier is right now. It's not hard stuff, as all these people have shown, but it becomes more challenging when you got to go into the like Niger and start talking to people, right? And that's time.
Any answer?
I would just add to that, you're right on. It takes a lot more effort to get that citizen science on the ground. You got to send these people the equipment to do it, or you got to organize them. Completeness is probably one of the things I would say is our sort of a stumbling block, because we can sort of expect that everybody's going to walk around in Boulder and observe the world around them and put it onto OpenStreetMap, but when there's a fence or a gate, that information beyond that gate becomes incomplete on the map. So working with local governments and universities at getting these programs instilled, and then actually developing a program to go out and get permission to go into these places and do some fine-grained observing. I think it's a much more difficult ask to make that happen versus throwing them in imagery and having trace roads.
Is this like a last mile issue? Is the difficulty in reaching and I've got to know where all the schools are, say in Addis Ababa. Is my challenge going to be that the people who know where the schools are don't have internet connectivity? Well, maybe Addis is not a good example. Let's say someplace in Niger. Is my challenge going to be that the people who know where the schools are don't have smartphones? Or is it going to be that they've got smartphones, they just don't, there's no intermediary between me and them to connect the two of us?
Both, I'd say, but probably more the latter. The latter is a problem even when you have smartphones, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get them to care? How do you get both of them? How do you get them to care? And so there's work to kind of grow communities around this stuff, right? So like whether it's your local top chapter or it's just there's on the ground kind of real world practices and applications where you can hit someone's smartphone and say, please go take a picture of this thing, go take a picture of. But the best success I've seen is with the Twitter stuff, right? Where you can kind of passively monitor what they're doing already and try to make sense of that, but then you're not. It's a less direct connection.
Mm-hmm. So is hot the best story? I mean, who's best suited now to make connections between, professor at CU Boulder and a bunch of people on the ground in Niger? Is it hot? Who's at the forefront?
Because map-wise, maybe. But I think it's also, it depends on the goal. If you're just looking for all the schools, maybe there is already an NGO locally that can provide that data, and then we can remotely get into the map. So that's a difficult question to kind of nail who's best at doing what. It really depends on the goal, the desired outcome.
Well, let's take as the desired outcome knowing the location of every school in Niger, and let's assume that I cannot reach, that there is no NGO that has already collected that information, and let's assume further that the NGOs that are in the region, they either are unresponsive or they say that's not my mission. Is there a way to reach is there a way to collect that data?
So we could probably help you by saying, here are all the buildings that we've seen from space or from maps that look like they might be schools. And we can give you square footage, and we can say estimate number of pupils per square foot, and we can tell you, you can look at an image today versus an image last year and see if it's grown or see if there's people coming in or out or cars parking at that kind of stuff. So it's actually a real active, used building. But then how do you take that? And so now you can fly to Niger yourself, and you've got your top 1,000 places to go knock on the door if you want to do it that way, right? Or you've got a top 1,000 list to give to somebody in Niger that you can make a connection with. But that last mile is really tough. I mean, the only bit that I could suggest there is that a lot of times by doing these things, by broadcasting your desire to understand the answer, you get in touch with people because you're just out there waving the flag, right? So the hot teams who do this stuff started out as OSM tracers probably, and then one guy in Mexico was like, oh my god, I live in Puerto Vallarta, I'm going to go tell my friends, come do this thing, and then we'll become that on the ground team. Right? These communities kind of conform organically, but in terms of just a global network that you can just like tap into and say, solve my problem, I don't know if that
Doesn't exist.
I think public information plays a public information and kind of data synthesis using multiple sources would play an important role, because I know like the State Department or the CIA World Factbook that some of these multilaterals or larger organizations in the NGO community have missions to, I think, look at some of that stuff, but there's no one silver bullet. I think it would be a pretty complex problem that would involve lots of different data.
What I found with this particular problem is that there's plenty of these data sets, especially in Africa,
Right.
that just don't exist. CIA doesn't know where the schools are. There are NGOs in Africa that don't know where the schools are. The government is just not big enough to know where the schools are. So this is not a problem, as far as I can tell, of just finding the person who already has the data, because nobody has the data.
Even locally, though.
Even locally.
Well, I mean, wasn't Captain Good Living Labs focused on tracing the schools and the medical facilities until very recently? Still, they were gathering that information before the earthquake, even a couple of years ago, because there wasn't a unified list. So
I know they did a bunch of sort of work over
Right.
the last couple years. I don't know what their specific
But
goal was.
I think that
but-
was one of the missions, there's much broader, but I think it may be a local organization that, sort of fits into the bigger networks is something, one of the way of getting at these data, because KLL is partnering with HOT, as far as I know, but it's also kind of a locally grown community. And so they focus on things that are locally relevant, and they have to actually go and look, actually take a survey. So maybe that kind of sort of crossing the scales in a way, from the global community to sort of local chapters in a way.
Well, ideally, that's our solution for all geodata, is having local people contributing that knowledge to OpenStreetMap. So then OpenStreetMap itself is sort of that answer of, I just go export all the schools from Nigeria, but at this point, I couldn't give you any sort of, how complete that data set is, or even how big the local community there is. But the long-term answer hopefully will be that there's enough OpenStreetMap contributors sort of dispersed throughout the world that can provide that very local information.
So OpenStreetMap might be the ideal midpoint for the place to collect information, but the question still remains, how to get people to put information into OpenStreetMap.
Exactly.
Yeah, think about it right now. If I had to try and find a name for the old schools of Niger, the first place I would go would be OSM and say, but Adobe Wikipedia, right? And I know it would be incomplete, but it would be probably the best comprehensive, publicly available data set that exists at the moment, right? So if I were to go and find all of the other 5,000 schools that aren't in there, and I wanted to put them somewhere so that other people could find them and wouldn't have to go to the pain that I just gone through, probably OSM and Wikipedia would be two candidates for where that repository would live, right? And I'd love to be able to go to the Niger Board of Education or niger.edu and just right-click download, and there's my shapefile.
Right.
But probably doesn't work as good.
Another aspect is resource identification. So like schools that can provide shelter in a disaster. So, and then Rich Lopez from Community Foundation talked about identifying available bed space. And I thought that was really interesting, like in mountain communities. So where can people go if their house is washed away or something? I think there's different ways to do that.
It's interesting to me, I've seen things pop up following a disaster. One in particular, a local club here in Bonner, had an ingenious, they would post a picture of the house, and they knew they were additional lodging. Post on there, or they connect with people who needed help moving their stuff in a picture of dropping in or organizing things to look at. So things often spontaneous that pop up too. It's small.
A visual of that space could be another tag on OSM.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Luke, you mentioned using mechanical sorting. So it's basically paying people to provide information. How do you avoid, and you mentioned one of the pitfalls of that we might just click through because, it's another 5 cents for push a button. How do you do your quality control?
Statistics, that's basically it. So we have a whole set of algorithms where we're running behind the scenes to figure out who's right, who's wrong. We're not who's right, we don't have ground truth, but who's agreeing. So it's sort of, you're inferring the truth from data you collect. And you can notice patterns in both the geographical consensus and dispersion that help you hone in on goodness, as well as when the individuals contribute, right? So the patterns that are used. If you see someone who's done 1,000 maps and never got a single point, good chance that that person is just trying to click through to get paid more. And so then you can do things like revoke qualifications or not pay people who do bad jobs. But it's really, it's a combination of, I would say, like some sort of first principle statistics as well as kind of 9 years of experience of just figuring out how to prevent scammers but still keep your data throughput high. What's the right price point that keeps people motivated, that doesn't let them scam? What are the right bundles of tasks? So I show you one map and then pay you to do 10 before you get paid, or do you have to get validated by some expert at the end to do that as well? So there's a whole kind of suite of sort of statistical stuff, but also just kind of it's a set of hacks that we built up over the years that makes it work.
We do a lot of A/B testing to figure out, what's the right price point, what's
Yeah, we do. And of the UI,
Yeah.
of the analysis methods, of the payment methods, and then we'll often reach out to people who are really good. So like, hey, we want you to do more. We'll only invite good people that can cultivate a community, both the free, motivated community who want to sort of join together, as well as the paid people. I mean, for some people, this is their job, right? There's people in India who make their livelihood from doing planning research kits, and they even have like shops where they'll train other people to do more, and it's pretty amazing. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of good foundational principles that you can adopt, and a lot of just tweaking to make it work.
So going off that, has there been any, have you guys looked into whether it's like a cost benefit of having like trained, maybe not professionals, but people with like more training doing all this, or having it be open source, and like what the benefits versus disbenefits of those are?
Yeah, I think like this is where I see the interaction between the stuff that we do and the stuff that OSM and especially Pop does. And like we designed Tomlin from the beginning to be stupid easy, but it's not stupid. And so you really can just click. That's pretty much it. Sometimes you can say yes or no. We've recently experimented with polygons, but it's tough, right? I mean, it's way more clicks, and then it's harder to validate and that kind of stuff. But the point being that we're trying to engage the largest possible audience and then rely on volume and sort of statistics to filter it down and come to a convergence, right? Whereas the OSM model is much more being, we trust you kind of a priori, and you're only here because you came through the community and you wanted to do it, and friends are into growing or whatever. So I don't know if you feel like there's more of an individual emphasis, maybe.
Yeah, I would say we probably have a much larger spectrum of mappers too. So, we have the people that have never mapped before in their life, but they heard about the hurricane and somehow found our platform to map. And then we have professional mappers that have been doing, this is their career, this is their life, and they're kind of, I'll say they are paid. Some of them are paid to do this, to contribute to OpenStreetMap. I think like the model is interesting because the quality control in OpenStreetMap is really, it's that volume piece, but it's more the passion. When people edit in near Bailey, Colorado, where I'm from, I get notices and I go check. So it's that sort of passion level of, I've taken ownership of my neighborhood, and anybody that edits in here, I'm going to go back and validate. And if there's something they did wrong or weird, I message them, I start that communication, and also try to get them involved in the larger project. So, the spectrum of sort of who is doing the OpenStreetMap mapping it's all over the board.
Okay, and with that, it's 12:30. I think we should thank our panelists once again.